even though Texas has a unique electricity market, that wasn't the main problem with the power outage crisis. Their treatment of electricity as just another product, it helped to create the conditions that led to the outages because the weatherization wasn't done for profit reasons. We have to discuss as a country how important we consider our electricity grids to be, because the market chose not to prepare the Texas grid for cold weather. It wasn't required by or paid for by the citizens via the government. And like Joe said, no private for-profit company who's required to bid for a project is going to add extra costs because they won't win the bid. Government allowed these companies to be free to make those choices for society. But when the lights went out, who paid? Well, at least 111 Texans paid with their lives.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can't stick to your story if you think it flies. But I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the 231st episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If this is your first time listening to Congressional Dish, hello. This is a podcast that is about what goes on in Congress. Congress is the branch of government that makes the laws that every American has to live by. I consider it enormously important, and yet most Americans generally don't give a fuck. But I give a fuck, and so in 2012, I started this podcast in order to share with, I didn't even know, anyone who gave a fuck, I guess. I wanted to share the information that I was finding while reading bills and laws and watching hearings. And I wanted to share all the information that I discovered that wasn't being discussed anywhere that I was looking. And 9 years later, because it turns out that Americans, and not just Americans, people from all over the world, but people actually do give a fuck and are craving this information. And so many people have paid me for doing this work so that this became my full-time job, and I'm going to keep doing it. And so thank you to all the Congressional Dish producers for incentivizing me to keep doing this job that I love most of the time. Because one of the hardest things about the way I've chosen to do Congressional Dish is that I'm not a member of any political team, and I'm not going to join one, because I think the only team that really matters as far as my, stories that I tell you are concerned is that I'm an American. That's what's on my passport. That is the group that I have invested, by force, yes, but have invested into, make function. I pay thousands of dollars every year into this government. So I'm an American, and that's the end. But the people that do declare themselves loyal to a political party or especially ideology, or even cable news station, you know that the whole scene is nasty and mean when we get super tribal. And so I just want no part of that. I just want to know who are the people who are making our whole country's laws. And it turns out that we've trusted some really strange people with that power. But I also want to know what those weirdos are doing with my tax investments and how we're being represented by them in the world. Because Congress has been my window to the world. This world and our role in it, it's all so fascinating to me, and especially the conversations amongst the powerful about what they're up to. I love every second of eavesdropping on them. And what's great is that I'm doing it with information that is public. I'm just watching hearings that are on the internet. The only thing that makes me different from anybody else is that A, I'm taking the time to watch them, and then B, I'm taking the time to summarize them in this podcast for you. And I really am amazed and grateful every day that these hearings are aired online to the public. It's one of my favorite things about our system. Our entire system isn't broken. There are good parts to it. I do everything that I do for this show from wherever I am. All this stuff that I'm doing, all the bills, all the laws, all the hearings, all the sound clips from press conferences. I mean, this is all available to anyone in the world who wants to watch it. And that level of transparency, it's something I'm proud of in our system, and I don't think I say it nearly enough. But today's episode I'm producing essentially because I want to, because I'm fascinated by weather, and I have been my entire life. In fact, I get weirdly excited about thunderstorms. I think most people that have seen me in action find it endearing, although I could also see if they behind my back say I'm insane. I wouldn't even be offended by that because I have such a deep, passionate love for the Doppler radar. And like the Weather Channel is my zen. I love it so much. Waking Up with Al and and the Cantori siblings, who doesn't love them? And so being, this, when a snowstorm knocked out the power to a whole bunch of states in mid-February, that's something that just by my very nature I was fascinated with. I mean, it snowed in Galveston. For those of you who don't understand where Galveston is, that is off the southern coast of Texas. It's basically in the Gulf of Mexico. And it is a place that you've probably heard of, if you've heard of it, because it keeps getting slammed with hurricanes. And I've been to Galveston. Like in my head, when I think of hot and muggy and Gulf, I think of Galveston. And it snowed there. So, Texas in particular was hit especially hard with the consequences of this very rare storm. The storm knocked out power to millions of people. And, when it comes to being interested in this, when the power went out, my husband is a utility scale solar power engineer. And so that part of the story definitely interested him. So it's been a topic in the Briney household. And so when I saw on my list of hearings that there's been 3 hearings about the storm in Congress in the last 2 months, I wanted to watch them. And so I did. And what I found in those hearings, I feel is worth sharing. And that's what this episode is today. And so this episode's going to summarize 2 of those 3 hearings, because one of them was about the military's infrastructure during the storm. And the bottom line is they were fine. They are fine. It's all fine. But it's the civilian infrastructure. That's where the most serious problems were. Now, the good news is that the causes seem clear. There are solutions, and those solutions are obvious. But the bad news is that it turns out those have been obvious for a long time, and the Texas state government just didn't do anything about it. And so ultimately, this is going to be a story about regulation, about the role of government, which at some point we Americans do need to come to an agreement on so that we can more effectively use the government we're paying for to provide the most basic functions, like keeping the damn lights on level of basic. But yeah, as an American who likes having light and heat and running water in my home, I wanted to know what the hell happened in Texas and what needs to happen to make sure it doesn't happen again. And I do know that my perceptions of what happened were altered by watching these hearings. There was a lot of bullshittery going on when it came to identifying causes of this in the corporate media. And so I think we all will learn something in what I'm sharing with you today. But before I do that, it's been a while. And so I just want to remind the golf swing haters that yes, putting the golf swing over my fucks and shits is a form of censorship. I get it. But there are podcast directories in countries that have billions of people living in them, including millions of American voters, that will not put the show, will not put Congressional Dish or any other podcast in their directories if there are fucks and shits being thrown around. As soon as I put the explicit label on Congressional Dish, it would get thrown out of those directories. And yes, I know that maybe I could just do this show and not say those words, because I know it's not professional to talk like that, Dad. But I want to talk the way I talk on this show. I want to explain things how they make sense in my profanity-laced head. And so, instead of censoring myself to the point that I can't use some words that I love and that I think are funny. I don't want to have to be prohibited from saying words, and so I put the sound effect over them. That keeps this show available to billions of people, and yet I can say whatever I want, whatever word pops into my head. But on top of that, that's the main reason why we have to do it. But on top of that, there is the added benefit that some people, including many, many sweet middle American people, just don't like those words. And that's okay. And the golf swing makes this podcast tolerable to them. And you know what? I do feel bad for you guys because I don't think you should have to get this information from me. I know it's wrong. The news should talk about these things. You should be able to get these stories from people who do the NPR voice and who won't drop an F while your kid is in the car. I get it. I empathize. Just not enough to stop talking like me, but I empathize, and this is our compromise. And this is working for us. And so if you don't like it, do you want to change in the format of the show? Well, co-produce the show. Pay per episode, whatever you think the episodes are worth, and I will give you the golf swing free feed of the public episodes on Patreon. So everyone can have their way on the golf swing. Now, I called that uncensored feed my green room. It's the Patreon feed, but then I also have a separate way to get it to you. Because I also put more uncensored content up there for producers than goes out to the public. And I have a new bonus episode up there for the green room for you related to the research for this episode. Because there was a guy who was called to testify in both of the hearings. And of course, I'll tell you all about this in the episode. But there was a guy who testified in both of the hearings that, let's just say right now that he made a lot of claims and threw out a lot of numbers. But I just, as he was talking, suspected that he was full of shit. Like, he made a bunch of claims about batteries for solar power that, speaking as someone who's married to a man who designs and does the financials for some of the largest solar projects on Earth, who is also now doing so for a large multinational company, like, the man knows a lot, and I work 10 feet from his desk. And so as I'm listening to this guy in the hearing, I just realized that I had a resource that could help me figure out how seriously to take this guy's testimony, because I had doubts about the information he was providing, but I don't have the technological knowledge, but my husband does. And so Joe and I watched one of the hearings together, the House one, with the mics on. And the thing was, by the time we watched this, I had already watched the hearing. And so the file that you're going to hear, it goes about 2 hours long, but we cut off the hearing early after I got the answers from Joe that I needed. And then I went to Chipotle and got dinner and went to bed. But basically, if you want to, you can listen to that episode and essentially sit on the couch with us. And I would speed it up with, if I were you, because it's a lot more hearing than it is conversation. But you can hear a decent portion of one of the hearings with our commentary. And that means you can hear for yourself how I formed the thoughts that led to the story I'm going to tell you today. And this is producers only stuff. It's what goes on behind the scenes while I'm working on these. And I do love sharing that with producers. So that's what else you get if you pledge on Patreon or with any other way, because the way you get access to the Green Room feed, again, you can pledge any amount per episode on Patreon. So you're only paying for what you're getting, and you're essentially paying only for public main episodes. All the bonus thank you episodes, those are free. Or you can donate to the show using a paper check or Venmo or PayPal or cryptocurrency or Zelle, whatever you want. And just make sure that we get your email address and we can email you instructions for our jerry-rigged way to also get you that feed. All producers can get the Green Room feed now. And if you do it the jerry-rigged way, it's not hard to set up. It's just going to take us a minute to, get you that email, because the people that run this podcast are me and my sister. It's a very small operation over here. But yeah, like I said, I like the fucking golf swing, but I get it if you don't. And so the solution is in your hands. Okay, so Winter Storm Uri, which, by the way, this whole naming of winter storms thing, that's not an official thing. The Weather Channel created names for winter storms. The World Meteorological Organization names hurricanes, so those are real names. But the whole idea that our winter storms have names is just a silly Weather Channel thing. But I did notice that not just the Weather Channel was calling the storm Winter Storm Uri, so it's spreading in the United States, this naming nonsense. So that's the name of the winter storm that took place in the United States between February 12th and 16th. Now, this was a storm that cut across the country in a top-down direction. So it started its journey across the country by dumping almost a foot of snow in Seattle, and then about half a foot, give or take some inches, all over the middle of the country, all the way down to South Texas, and then it went into Arkansas and Mississippi. I mean, it was all over the place. But like I said, Galveston in the Gulf of Mexico got measurable snow for the first time in 13 years. In total, snow fell on 80% of Texas, with the capital of Texas, Austin, receiving their heaviest snowfall in 72 years. And after the snow fell for about 5 days, it was really, really cold. And the electricity infrastructure in the state of Texas didn't handle the storm well. And that's also true of other states, but today we're going to focus on Texas, mainly because that's the only state that Congress has bothered to hold hearings about since the storm. But Texas does have a unique electricity situation because around World War II, Texas created a statewide electricity system, a grid, just for its state, just for Texas. And in the decades that followed, Texas, or at least most of Texas, because the Texas state grid provides 90% of Texas's electricity, well, 90% of Texas, 26 million Texans, have collectively decided to keep their grid disconnected from the other two huge grids in our country. Basically, when it comes to interconnected electricity grids, there's one in the West, one in the East, and there's Texas. And one of the main reasons that Texas did this is that by not connecting to other states, Texas doesn't have to follow some federal electricity laws. So by being its own power island, it is to an extent allowed to do its own thing. And so in 1999, the Texas state version of a Congress, their legislature, voted to deregulate their energy industry, which in normal language means that they voted to let customers, so us, choose which company supplies our energy if you are a resident of Texas using this grid. Basically, this meant that the utility companies would have to let other companies use their systems to sell power if we wanted to buy power from somebody else. And if that sounds unfair in some way to utilities, it's not. So here is my husband, Joe, in our conversation in that Green Room episode.
Because we looked at developing projects in West Texas, and basically what happens is when you develop these renewable projects, if you need to tie into the grid, you're responsible for paying for that transmission line to tie into the grid. And not only that, you're responsible for any upgrades to the grid that are necessary for your project to interconnect. So if they need to, replace some power lines or replace some capacitors or, do whatever, they'll do the work, but you have to pay for them to do the work. And until they do that, you cannot interconnect.
And so within Texas, power is created and sold by private and public companies like the one my husband works for, along with companies that produce nuclear power, gas power, and coal power. And there is an organization, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT, which coordinates the power being created and provided by all of those companies. So this next clip is of Bill Magnus. He is the president and CEO of ERCOT, and he's testifying to the House on March 24th.
Let me give you a bit of background to explain ERCOT's role in the provision of electric power in Texas. We manage the flow of electric power to more than 26 million Texas customers. That's about 90% of the state's electric load and about 75% of the landmass of Texas. ERCOT does not own power plants. We do not own poles and wires. We are the grid operator, like air traffic control for the grid.
So individual, mostly private companies create the power in Texas, and then individual companies, mostly private, deliver it. ERCOT just coordinates it all.
We're also the settlement agent for the market. We do the bookkeeping and billing. We don't participate in the financial side of our market. Our number one job is to see that supply and demand on the grid are in balance at all times.
But how do they prioritize who gets power when everyone is demanding power and there's not enough to go around? Like, who makes those rules? Well, the rules for that balance game that ERCOT is in charge of, including, how much can be charged, who gets access to the grid, all those rules are not written by ERCOT, the air traffic controller of the grid.
ERCOT's not a policymaking body. We implement the policies adopted by the Public Utility Commission and the Texas Legislature, and we operate under reliability rules adopted by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC.
The president and CEO of the organization that sets the standards, NERC, was invited to testify in both hearings that I'm highlighting today from both the House and the Senate. His name is James Robb, and I don't have a clip of him to play for you right now, but I will. And so just know that the top dog from NERC, which is the standard-setting agency, did testify. And he's a big deal because those are standards that are set for the entire country. And actually, now that I say that, he's an even bigger deal than that because It actually sets the standards for Canada and Mexico too. So it's an international standard setting agency. But back to Bill Magnus, the head traffic controller of the Texas grid. Here's where the power in Texas comes from.
Generators produce power from a variety of sources in ERCOT, such as gas, coal, wind, solar, and nuclear. These are private and public entities subject to regulation by various state and federal agencies. Transmission and distribution providers own the wires and transport the power to consumers subject to their own sets of federal and state regulation. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, ERCOT monitors the entirety of the system to make sure that when transmission lines go down, we can work around them. We talk to generators, instructing them to bring load onto the system or to back it down as needed. We oversee the scheduling of maintenance and more. The work is done with one purpose, to maintain the 60 hertz frequency that's needed to ensure the stability of the grid. It's a constant balancing act to manage the supply and demand to ensure a stable frequency.
And here's what he said happened in mid-February, during and after Winter Storm Uri, when at least 4.5 million Texans lost power and at least 111 Texans died of hypothermia because of this extended power outage that wasn't expected, and therefore many Texans weren't prepared for it. Like, the Texans knew about the weather forecast, obviously, but no one had warned them that they would be without power for days. And so here's what Bill Magnus, the head traffic controller of the Texas grid, said happened in mid-February.
During the week of February 15th, the Texas electric market experienced more demand than available supply. At its worst, the storm took out 48.6% of the generation available to ERCOT to balance the grid. We always keep reserves, but when you lose nearly half your generation, you're going to have a problem. As supply quickly diminished, the frequency of the grid dipped perilously low. Many generators stayed off for days, and this left the system unable to serve that high demand. We used the last tool in our toolkit, planned outages, calling for load shed to manage the stability of the grid. This crisis required ERCOT using procedures established for emergencies like this to call on transmission providers to use controlled load shedding to balance the system and prevent a devastating blackout for the entire grid. Avoiding a complete blackout is critical. Were it to occur, the Texas grid could be down for several days or weeks, while the damage to the electrical grid was repaired and the power restored in a phased and highly controlled process. The cost of restoration of the system, the economic loss for Texas, and the personal cost to the well-being of Texas citizens would be unfathomable. As terrible as the consequences of the controlled outages in February were, if we had not stopped the blackout, power could have been out for over 90% of Texans for weeks. The steps we took were difficult, but they had to be taken. And when power was able to be fully restored, the Texas electric delivery system immediately returned to its pre-emergency conditions.
So the power outages were on purpose, to essentially prevent their entire grid from shutting down, which could take much, much longer to fix. But what happened to cause that to even be necessary? Why didn't Texas have enough energy to meet the demand? Because before watching this hearing, based on the common wisdom being thrown around in the Twitterverse, I was expecting to hear that the reason was because Texas went all, yeehaw, we do our own thing down here, and have a separate grid to get out of national level regulations. I was expecting to hear that their disconnection from other states prevented power that could have prevented this whole blackout from flowing into Texas when they needed it. But in the hearing, that's not what I heard. So here's Christy Craddock. She is the chairman of the Railroad Commission of Texas, testifying to the House. And the Railroad Commission is actually the law enforcement branch for energy in Texas, even though it sounds like it would be a transportation thing. But here's the head of the Railroad Commission telling the House what really caused the lack of power.
As the storm sat over Texas, wind, solar, coal, nuclear, oil, and natural gas all experienced challenges. Through numerous conversations with the oil and gas industry and operators, we learned of frozen roadways preventing crews from accessing the fields. But the number one problem we heard reported from operators was a lack of power at their production sites. As outages spread across the state, operators were unable to keep their systems functioning as power was cut. Some operators did need to preemptively shut in their wells for safety and well integrity purposes prior to the storm, beginning as early as February 9th. Starting on Tuesday, February 16th, as it was safe to return to the oil fields, crews arrived to find that their facilities were experiencing electricity outages. The oil fields simply cannot run without power, making electricity the best winterization tool.
Which actually, hearing that made me think of Fukushima. Because in 2011, that nuclear power plant melted down because it needed power to safely make power. So when the tsunami knocked out the power, they couldn't cool off the fuel rods. And now the surrounding area is uninhabitable for, we don't even know. It's already been a decade, and there's at least a few more to go. But this is another example of power sources needing power to do their thing. So why couldn't they get it? And it turns out that the reason isn't what you probably think.
I believe that transmission pipes are in the ground, and that's natural insulation, where we do have some challenges when you had the electricity roll off into fields and across the state. Then we did have problems with compressors that are electric compressors and or natural gas compressors. Like, you can't move stuff in a pipe if you've got in a compressor without electricity. So, but the pipes themselves did not freeze. And I think that's been a miscommunication across when you've looked at the press communication.
So it wasn't frozen pipes that stopped the electricity from flowing to the power sources. Instead, it turns out that these energy generation facilities weren't prioritized for electricity, the limited electricity they had, because of paperwork. Specifically, voluntary paperwork that the companies didn't volunteer to fill out. So here's Representative Mark Vesey of Texas talking to Christy Chaddock of the Railroad Commission.
We also know that many natural gas producers and processors failed to file the necessary paperwork with the electric utility to be listed as critical infrastructure. That meant that when we had rolling blackouts and when they were initiated, these natural gas companies didn't have the electricity necessary to pull gas from underground, which in turn led to a natural gas shortage of power plants and created a downward spiral of more blackouts. Right now, it's optional for these companies to file this paperwork. But Charlie Guerin, also from Fort Worth, he has a bill, Commissioner Craddock, that he is going to file that will answer some of these concerns that I just laid out. And I want to ask you, Commissioner Craddock, should these energy producers, who we all know are critical to keeping the lights on, so we won't have a repeat of what we saw, should they be required to file this paperwork? And should it be included on the electric utilities critical list?
I think it's an important piece that, frankly, my agency hadn't been communicated from ERCOT that this existed. But two, if you look at for these forms, and the time when we finally realized this form existed, because it was based on summertime, not wintertime. But when we realized that, we've now sent a letter to every single operator that we regulate, suggesting that they file this form.
But you don't think it should be required?
The challenge we still have, though, is ERCOT today doesn't prioritize gas fields. It's only gas processing plants forward. So we'd like to encourage ERCOT to remap the system and understand that the whole system needs to be included, not just part, because we had operators who told us they would have been happy to file the form had, one, they known about it, and two, had they been included in the form, and they were not.
So because the energy producers didn't file paperwork needed to get them on the critical infrastructure list, to get them prioritized for power when power is limited, they didn't get prioritized, which is a super dumb system. It does seem like the prioritization maps should be redrawn to include power sources that need power without the need for some form that says the obvious. So the good news here is that this is easy to fix. But voluntary standards were problematic far beyond paperwork. So here's Representative Diana DeGette of Colorado. She's the chair of the House subcommittee that hosted this hearing. Speaking first to Bill Magnus, so he's the ERCOT power traffic controller guy. Then she's going to speak to Sylvester Turner, who is the current mayor of Houston, Texas, who was in the Texas State Congress for almost 3 decades before becoming Houston's mayor. And then she'll talk to James Robb, who's that big deal dude from the international organization that sets all the standards, NERC.
ERCOT has stated publicly that the recent extreme weather in Texas, quote, caused many generating units across fuel types to trip offline and become unavailable. Isn't it true that during the extreme weather event, natural gas, wind, coal, solar, and even nuclear power were forced offline.
Yes, Chairman, we did see periods of time where each one of those types of generation tripped offline.
Thanks. And as devastating as this was, I guess a lot of people were surprised because, Mayor, you were in the Texas legislature for more than 25 years, and you said in your written testimony the magnitude, and also today, the magnitude of damages was foreseeable and preventable. The Texas grid must be designed with the full appreciation that climate change is real and extreme weather events can occur throughout the year. Is it your view that Texas ignored these warnings and missed several opportunities to fortify the grid against the threat of extreme weather?
And Madam Chair, the answer is yes. I was in the legislature when the winter storm occurred in 2011. In fact, I filed House Bill 1986 that specifically would mandated the Public Utility Commission to have ERCOT have a sufficient reserve to prevent blackouts. That was in 2011. The bill was not in
Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Robb, I understand that NERC has issued a series of recommendations in recent years warning about reliability risk to the Texas grid, including after this same storm that hit Texas in 2011. Now, I know NERC's inquiry is ongoing, but based on the information you have, did Texas winterize its power infrastructure to the degree NERC had recommended after the 2011 storm?
Well, the inquiry will affirm this, but evidence would suggest absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
And here's my husband, Joe, in our Green Room episode with an example of what weatherization means, specifically in regards to wind power. Because the bullshitterverse that is Fox News placed the blame for the power outages squarely and solely upon renewable power, with a special emphasis on wind. So, for example, here's Tucker Carlson.
The windmills failed, like the silly fashion accessories they are, and people in Texas died.
Here's Larry Kudlow on Fox Business.
Now, folks, this is all more proof that green energy just is not ready for prime time. You get sub-freezing temperatures, and wind and solar just don't work for power.
And it's not just idiot pundits that are paid millions by Fox News that were saying stuff like this. Like, here's Governor Abbott, the governor of Texas, in an interview on Fox News.
Sean, this shows how the Green New Deal would be a deadly deal for the United States of America. Texas is blessed with multiple sources of energy, such as natural gas and oil and nuclear, as well as solar and wind. But you saw from what Trace said, and that is our wind and our solar got shut down, and they were collectively more than 10% of our power grid. And that thrust Texas into a situation where it was lacking power in a statewide basis that was power that was spread out by that ERCOT organization that you were talking about.
Now, let's just take a beat here and acknowledge that wind and solar, like he said, he dropped in a little factoid there. Wind and solar make up only 10% of Texas's grid. Natural gas makes up half of it. So the grid can't go down on this scale only because of a source that makes up 10%. So let's just acknowledge that. But it's also just simply nonsense to place the blame for the entire Texas power crisis on renewables, because it didn't have to be this way. So here is my expert in renewable energy, my husband, Joe Briney.
Just because it got cold, that doesn't mean like wind turbines are just going to shut off all the time. You could weatherize wind turbines and they would still work. Like, they ice up and so they stop because you don't want a big blade slinging a huge piece of ice, or the ice would be too heavy, it would break the thing, so it stops. But you could design it with heaters on the blades. You could put like a slip coating on the blades to keep ice from building up. So you could have a wind turbine. Like, there are wind turbines in very, very cold places that deal with worse weather than Texas saw, right? But Texas just didn't require them to design to that standard. So the idea that like cold weather just shuts these things down, that's also not true. It's just the minimum standard that was designed to was just not good enough.
And the idea that renewable energy sources, wind in particular, were the main root of the power outage, that idea was shut down in the Senate hearing by Senator Angus King of Maine, who is an independent that votes most of the time with the Repubs. And in this conversation, he's speaking to Pat Wood, who used to be the chair of the Public Utility Commission in Texas, a position he was appointed to by George W. Bush. And then he got promoted to the chair of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is another position that he was granted by George W. Bush. So this is a conversation between two people that are more Republican than not. But it is worth knowing that the witness here, Pat Wood, is currently a director at SunPower, which is a solar energy company. But regardless, here's their conversation.
Can you tell us unequivocally that wind turbines did not cause the problem in Texas?
They did not cause the problem. There were, honestly, the only thing was like gas and coal and
everything suffered.
Everything could have helped solve it more faster. But, wind was slow to get back, and so was coal, and so was gas.
And I want to mention that the wind project that I worked on in Maine has been online in 10 years in Maine, and it's never been down because of the cold that I know of. It was a question of their not weatherizing their turbines. So there's nothing intrinsic in the wind power that can't survive cold weather.
So basically, the overarching main problem was a lack of weatherization for cold weather on all of Texas's energy sources. And Texas has known about their lack of weatherization problem for a long time. So here's Jim Robb again, the big cheese at the international standard setting organization known as NERC.
Insufficient and inadequate weatherization of generation in Texas and the Middle South states has been a growing concern for us since 2012. After a cold weather event caused load shedding for 3 million customers in Texas in 2011, we developed a winter preparation guideline to focus industry on best practices and started conducting significant outreach on winter preparedness. Following additional extremes and unplanned load shedding in that region in 2018, we concluded that these events could no longer be treated as rare and that a mandatory approach was warranted. As a result, NERC began the process of adding mandatory weatherization requirements into our reliability standards.
And in this situation, the feds kind of have to step in, because here's how Texas, being allowed to do their own thing, handled the situation on the state level since that cold storm knocked out the power in 2011.
The report that we put out in 2011 called for very clear freeze protection on the generating plants and raised the issue as to whether that should extend into the natural gas supply as well. And what I understand Texas did was to put in place legislation that required weatherization, but not to a specific level. And it was not a aggressively enforced standard. I think it was spot checked, and enforcement against that was relatively modest, is my understanding. That's one of the reasons why I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I said that's one of the reasons why after the 2018 event, we concluded that we needed to move to a mandatory freeze protection standard for equipment and to have that be monitored and enforced by us.
And here's my darling husband, Joe, explaining the reality from inside the industry as to why an energy industry, Joe's company included, that's allowed to regulate itself is not going to weatherize their equipment voluntarily. Here's why regulation is necessary.
When we would bid into Texas utilities, it's like you have to design to the bare minimum standards. Otherwise, you're not going to be competitive and you're just not going to build anything. So it's like when they send out, a request for prices, you know exactly what the design standards are, and that's just what you're designing to. You're not going to voluntarily be like, you know what, just for you, I made this weatherized. Like, you're not going to do that. That's going to cost you more money. You're not going to win the bid. You're not going to build your project.
The market wants to build these things as cheap as possible. That's how profits are maximized. And the market-based structure was identified as a potential big picture problem by Mark Gabriel, who testified in the Senate hearing. Mark Gabriel is the administrator and CEO of the Western Area Power Administration, which is a part of the Department of Energy in charge of most hydroelectric projects. So those are ones like that generate electricity from dams, stuff like that. And he's in charge of those projects in the western half of the United States. And here's what he said to the Senate.
First, every form of generation can be disrupted by extreme temperatures. Second, a competitive market can discourage long-term capital investment in reliability and resilience measures. And finally, costs move in both directions in competitive markets, and electricity will flow often at times at impractical prices.
Which reminds me that I haven't focused much on the price situation because it wasn't a frequent topic in the hearing. But I should point out that because the market structure of the Texas electricity grid meant that it's governed by supply and demand, well, during and after the storm, the supply of power was low, demand was high, and so some companies charged their customers up to the top level allowed by ERCOT during the week of the storm, which was $9,000 per megawatt hour. This left some Texans who had chosen to get their power from companies that tied their prices to the market, as opposed to charging a fixed rate, to receive power bills that were thousands of dollars higher than they're used to. But Mark Gabriel's bottom line was this in his Senate testimony.
In conclusion, power and gas markets in the United States are marvelously efficient at driving out inefficient generating units, increasing financial liquidity, and expanding the sale of electricity. However, the real question is whether electricity and, to a lesser extent, natural gas are logical commodities to participate in open markets. Unlike pork bellies and orange juice, trading electrons has consequences far greater than the availability of bacon or a morning refreshment.
But even though there were some concerns, you just heard them, voiced about the market structure of Texas's electricity grid, the idea that was all over the internet that Texas's decision to keep their grid isolated from the other grids in the United States, the idea that that was key to their power problems in February, well, it turns out that that just doesn't appear to be true. Here's Senator Martin Heinrich of New Mexico speaking to Pat Wood III, who is the former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Public Utility Commission of Texas.
Would it have been helpful for Texas to be able to import power either from the east or the west in this recent episode? Because I noticed that El Paso Power, for example, El Paso didn't have the same rolling blackouts because they were able to pull from the western grid.
And they're directly interconnected with it. We do have some gates in the wall.
You have DC connections, but you don't have direct connections.
Correct. That's right. And there actually are proposals to put more of the DC ties in both east and west. To be honest, a few gigawatts wouldn't have hurt, but it wouldn't have saved us from really what was a 20 gigawatt shortfall.
What was the single largest shortfall from which generation source? If you look at,
well, our largest supplier on a normal day is gas, so the impact of gas dropping both at the supply level and then at the power plant level. And that's the interesting thing to figure out is how much was related to the lack of winterization, which we should have learned from the 2011 experience. How much was done from that, and how much actually had to do with the supply system or the upstream issues from the gas wells all the way down to the power plant.
Right.
And so even though Texas has a unique electricity market, that wasn't the main problem with the power outage crisis. Their treatment of electricity as just another product, it helped to create the conditions that led to the outages because the weatherization wasn't done for profit reasons. Which brings me back to the role of government. Because at some point, we need to stop talking about government in generalities of size, like big government or small government. And instead, as a country, we have to decide the proper role of a functional government. What should essential government services be? What are the services that every single American needs on standby? What are the needs of the entire society, things that every American can't live without? Those are the things we should be paying for collectively with taxes. We have police on that list. We have firefighters on that list. We have parks departments on that list. We have sewer systems on that list. You know, should electricity be on that list? And if it's not on that list, how many rules should we put in place? And not how many. And here I am going with the size thing again. It's not how many rules we put in place, but what rules are necessary. We have to discuss as a country how important we consider our electricity grids to be. Because the market chose not to prepare the Texas grid for cold weather. It wasn't required by or paid for by the citizens via the government. And like Joe said, no private for-profit company who's required to bid for a project is going to add extra costs because they won't win the bid. Government allowed these companies to be free to make those choices for society. But when the lights went out, who paid? Well, at least 111 Texans paid with their lives. And this is a conversation that we as a country need to have sooner than later because our power grids are changing right now. Here's Jim Robb from NERC, that international standard setting agency.
There are three major trends which are fundamentally transforming the bulk power system and challenging our historic reliability paradigms. First, the system is decarbonizing rapidly, and this evolution is altering the operational characteristics of the grid. Policies, economics, and market designs are resulting in significant retirements of traditional generation. New investment is increasingly focused on developing carbon-free generation with variable production profiles. And in this resource mix, natural gas-fired generation is becoming ever more critical, both for bulk energy to serve load and balancing energy to support the integration of these variable resources. Second, the grid is becoming more distributed. The improved economics of solar is a key example. These smaller scale resources have been deployed on both the bulk electric as well as distribution systems, and in many cases reside behind the meter. And third, the system is becoming increasingly digitized through smart meters and digital control systems. These investments greatly enhance the operational awareness and efficiency of grid operators, but at the same time, it heightens our exposure to cybersecurity risk.
And in this transition away from fossil fuel-based power sources to infinite renewable sources, here's their main areas of concerns in the United States. Here's Jim Robb.
Our reliability assessments are one important way we evaluate the performance of the grid, identify reliability trends, anticipate challenges, and provide a technical platform for important policy discussion. With growing reliance on variable and just-in-time resources, we are developing more advanced ways to study energy supply risk. Our assessments consistently have identified three regions of the country particularly exposed to these dynamics: California, Texas, and New England. Last August, a massive heat wave across the West caused an energy supply shortage in California in the early evening. Solar energy was ramping down, and the grid operator was unable to import power as planned due to high demand throughout the West. CalISO was forced to cut power to approximately 800,000 customers. Among the lessons learned from this event are, one, the critical need for reliable ramping resources to balance load, and second, the need for improved ways to estimate resource availability when the system is under stress. In New England, cold weather exacerbates its dependence on limited pipeline capacity and a handful of critical fuel assets. An early January cold snap in 2018 led to natural gas shortages, and fuel oil was burned to preserve reliability. Had that cold snap not abated when it did, the fuel oil inventory would eventually be exhausted, and ISO New England almost certainly would have needed to shed load. It was a classic near-miss event.
And then, of course, the third situation was the Texas situation, which they are concerned about for obvious reasons. But this is the focus of the international standard setters. And when it comes to renewable energy, the California situation, which is also applicable to Texas, well, when it comes to renewables and their part in this whole energy mix, Jim Robb was crystal clear about what the best solution is. It was not to just abandon renewables. But there is a problem with renewables that we need to acknowledge, which is that solar and wind are not always able to crank out power at full capacity because the sun does go down every day and sometimes the wind doesn't blow. And so here's how Jim Robb said that we are best equipped to handle that situation.
Well, the key to integrating large amounts of renewable resources is the balancing resource that picks up generation when the renewable resources can't perform because of weather conditions or what have you. And to date, the only real resource we have that can do that would either be hydro, as was mentioned earlier, or natural gas. And natural gas of those fuels is the most easily transported to where it's needed. So gas is the answer to making this transition work.
And here's husband Joe explaining why that is.
Nuclear and coal, basically, they're basically baseline, where they're pumping out their capacity all the time, like a big flat line of power. But you heard the ERCOT guys say that they have to match supply and demand. And so demand is always, moving up and down throughout the day. And so that's what they do now is they fire up these gas plants and then they turn them off.
Yeah.
And so that's what matches that curve. You can't do that with nuclear. You can't have all your power being nuclear. You have to have something that you can turn on and turn off really quickly.
And so the solution seems pretty clear. Solar and wind can provide plenty of power. We just need some gas for backup. But despite this testimony from the experts in the power field, Republicans, a disturbingly long line of them, used this hearing to air concerns about renewable energy, with uninformed claims about the technologies that made the hearing sound more like a tryout for a Fox News hosting position than a fact-finding hearing. So here's just one example of that. Here's Kathy McMorris. She represents Eastern Washington.
Recent trends show a transition away from coal and nuclear power plants, designed to function as baseload capacity, toward variable renewable energy sources with just-in-time natural gas backup. States like California that rely more on weather-dependent renewables experience energy failures on a regular basis. Indeed, California residents experience blackouts on an ongoing annual basis as the state fails to manage summer electricity demand and wildfire risk. These events suggest that replacing nuclear plants with variable renewable energy sources could make energy grids less resilient. Policies that drive renewables at the expense of firm baseload put lives at risk.
And yet none of the experts testified that that was true. And as a California resident here, I can also promise you that a lot of our power outages in the last few years have been because our private utilities didn't maintain our lines well enough. And so every time the wind blows, we're afraid they're going to fall down, cause sparks, and set a huge fire. That's why we're losing power here in California. But there was one person who was called to testify who was backing up claims like this from the Republicans like Kathy McMorris Rodgers, and that was the witness Michael Schellenberger. Michael Schellenberger was invited to testify in both hearings, in the Senate and the House, and he was the only witness that wasn't either a part of any government or regulatory agency or company directly involved with power production. Instead, Schellenberger's the founder and president of an organization called Environmental Progress, whose website claims to have, quote, helped save nuclear reactors around the world, unquote. And I can't prove this. I don't know that this is a fact in this case. But I do know that the minority party in these hearings, which would be the Republicans, are usually allowed to call at least one witness of their choice in these hearings. In this case, even though I can't prove it, I would bet my precious dog's life that Michael Schellenberger was the witness called by the fossil fuel money-drenched Republicans on these committees, because most Republicans directed their questions only at him and were given answers from Schellenberger that sounded like this.
I just will also mention this idea that there is some inevitability to a transition towards variable renewable energy sources is incorrect. It is not shared by most energy experts. It is a consequence of policy choices. And if we want to have affordable, reliable, resilient electricity sources, we need reliable sources of electricity produced in large, efficient power plants, whether nuclear, natural gas, or coal.
And I do have to give Schellenberger credit for laying his bias on the table because his agenda was clear.
You know, if we're going to shut down all of our nuclear plants, which are 20% of our electricity, then we better keep our coal plants around. And I say this as somebody that has long advocated the transition from coal to natural gas and nuclear.
And so as I watched this hearing, Schellenberger threw out a bunch of numbers and information, but I didn't know what to do about his testimony because I didn't know if I could trust him, because he seemed more of an advocate than an expert. And this conversation in particular scrambled my brain. So this is Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming. He's one of the most shameless fossil fuel advocates in Congress, who also just so happens to have taken over $770,000 that we know of in the last decade from people in the oil and gas industry, which is the industry that has been the most generous to him. Here he is talking to nuclear shill Schellenberger about batteries being a solution to renewable energy storage.
You know, you've written, and you said, quote, some have long pointed to batteries as the way to integrate unreliable renewables onto the grid. However, batteries, you say, are simply not up to the task today. And you went on to explain, indeed, for renewables to work, batteries would need to be able to store the power for weeks and perhaps even months. Can you expand upon the comments for the committee?
Sure. Well, we have one of the largest battery installations in the world in Escondido, California, and it provides power for 16,000 Californians for about 4 hours. There's almost 40 million Californians. The cost is prohibitively high, and in fact, most advocates of renewables now no longer think that lithium batteries are going to be an important form of storage beyond managing minutes or hours.
Well, it turns out that my husband has actually gone to that solar installation in Escondido. My husband also integrates batteries into the huge solar systems that he designs for utilities all the time. And so when we got to this part of the hearing, this is the conversation that Joe and I had.
I don't think lithium ion is like the final solution for batteries, but the only reason is that it's designed for density. It's designed to be portable. Like it's supposed to be in your phone, your laptop, your car. When we're putting these in at grid scale, we're putting them in like containers, like 40-foot containers. We're doing thousands of acres of solar and reserving 1 or 2 for a battery system. So we don't need density, which is what lithium ion provides. And so it's not necessarily, it wasn't designed to be a grid storage battery, although it works as one. Like you can design it to be as long of a duration as you want. It just depends on how you wire the cells together. You're not going to make it weeks, but people do it for, grids have been doing it for minutes, hours, based on what the grid needs at that time. So if you need to control the frequency of the grid, like the ERCOT guy said, and you can dispatch it in 15-minute intervals, maybe that's what the grid wants. So it's charging for 15 minutes, discharging for 15 minutes, charging for 15 minutes, just to balance that frequency, keep the lights on. You see a lot of 4-hour designs because you see solar produce power in the middle of the day, but you typically need power in the evening. That's when the big power spike is. So you want to shift the power about 4 hours. So that's why we see a lot of 4-hour designs. It's not because that's a technical limitation. It's just because that's what the market is looking for and what the utilities want. We're not going to design an 8-hour storage battery if they only want power stored for 4 hours. It goes back to that question of cost. We're not going to win a bid if we design it for twice as long that it has to be.
So is this guy right?
It's not going to hold it for weeks, but what you can do is you can just build a lot of batteries and have reserves the same way you have reserves in natural gas that they're talking about here. It's sort of the same principle. Like you can charge it. If you want to discharge it for weeks, you'd have to charge it for weeks, is what I'm saying. But you could charge it in the middle of the night and then just not discharge it and have it like online waiting to go for an emergency.
Okay. So technologically, this guy's full of shit. The batteries can hold it for more than 4 hours.
Yeah. What he's saying, yeah, like you can charge it and then it can just sit there and it'll, degrade by a couple of percent like over a long period of time, like your phone does. But it's not like it just dissipates or you have to get rid of it right away. What he's saying is like a lot of times we'll design a battery and it has a certain capacity and duration. Like we'll say we're giving you like 5 megawatts and a 4-hour duration. It means to charge it fully, you need to put 5 megawatts into it for 4 hours. But then at the end of it, you can take 5 megawatts out of it for 4 hours. So that's sort of what the duration is. But it can be in that battery for as long as you want it to be. He's sort of imagining a scenario where all the power goes down and you're just relying on batteries 4 weeks at a time. But you'd have to be charging them for weeks at a time. It's, I think, technically possible, but I don't see why anyone would design to that.
Well, I think that's what they're talking about, though. I mean, what Barroso said is we need batteries that will be able to store the power for weeks, perhaps even months.
You could store it for weeks or months. It wouldn't be discharging it and acting as like a second grid, like a backup grid. You know what I mean? Like if you needed Texas needs like 100 gigawatts of power. You're not going to have that 4 weeks at a time. You're not going to have batteries discharging that 4 weeks at a time unless you install that capacity first.
But then they're also discounting the idea that for weeks and months that the sun's not going to shine and the wind's not going to blow.
Yeah, exactly.
Are we serious?
Yeah, like we're just going to have this fleet of batteries to the side that, and in that case, like you're not having natural gas. You're not doing anything else either. It's sort of a weird... I don't know what the fuck he's talking about.
Okay.
But they're batteries. They're exactly the same that's in your...
Well, I mean, he keeps, in this, he says it provides power for 16,000 Californians for about 4 hours, as if it can only hold it for 4 hours. And that's one of those things where he scrambled my brain, and I'm like, that doesn't sound right.
It doesn't mean it holds it 4 hours. It means it's discharging for 4 hours. So, who knows when that power was put into the battery? That doesn't matter, but it's just when
But it can only give 4 hours. Why is it 4 hours?
because they designed to 4 hours.
So you're saying that he's right. Now I'm confused again.
No, okay, so that battery, that specific battery, was designed to discharge, I want to say it's like 20 megawatts for 4 hours.
But there's other batteries.
He could have made it 10 megawatts for 8 hours. Could have made it 5 megawatts for 16 hours. It would have been the same number of battery cells, just wired differently. But the reason they made it the way they did is because San Diego Gas and Electric just wanted some peak shifting. They wanted some of the solar from the middle of the day to go to that evening, which is about a 4-hour difference. So that's why they made a 4-hour battery.
Gotcha.
That was the specifications of
But that's not like a characteristic of all solar connected batteries.
No, it's just the most common because that's the most common use case.
Okay. Gotcha. Thank you.
You could design a massive, massive, massive battery that could technically supply power to everyone if you wanted to. But nobody's buying that.
So basically, when you hear that conversation between Senator Barrasso and Schellenberger,
he doesn't know how a fucking battery works.
Okay. That's pretty much my question. All right. And then after our conversation, Joe sent me an example of one of the brilliant new products that are being invented to make solar and wind more consistent that doesn't involve these lithium-ion batteries. So in the show notes, I have a website waiting for you about a advanced rail energy storage system, which is essentially a bunch of rail lines side by side on a hill near a solar installation with big, heavy buckets full of rocks on the rail lines. When the sun is blazing during the day, the excess power being generated is used to move those heavy buckets full of rocks up the hill. Then when the sun goes down, those buckets go down the hill, generating electricity as they do so. And I don't exactly understand how this magic works. I mean, like I drive an electric car that charges itself when I use the brakes, and every time it happens, it's like some kind of sorcery to me. But the point is that solutions are out there. They are brilliant. And we really can transition to power sources that don't emit poison methane or climate-altering carbon or run the risk of making our communities uninhabitable if there's an accident. But in the meantime, natural gas is turning out to be the bridge fuel that they said it would be, because it can be turned on and off the fastest when needed, so long as the right fucking paperwork is filed and the gas plants are prioritized for power when power supplies are short. Here's Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma, another Republican who used his time to shit on renewables, talking to Jim Robb of NERC.
Natural gas is quick to be able to turn on, but when you're not asked for much for a long period of time, and then suddenly you ask for a lot in a short period of time, especially in an extremely cold weather event, then suddenly it's like, you know what, we can't turn it all on that fast, that much. Is there a tipping point that you're seeing for providing other fuels that are out there that, for instance, we're 40, 50, 60% renewables, and you've got a very small portfolio of natural gas, and then the wind stops blowing and it's a cloudy day and you suddenly don't have those, and you ask natural gas to turn on 50% suddenly, that's just not realistic because what is upstream is not able to turn on that fast. Is that a realistic conversation?
I think that is the conversation that needs to take place. Natural gas plants are the most flexible that we have in the system to accommodate the variability that we see with large amounts of variable resources. And it is a real challenge for the natural gas industry to provide that kind of capacity that quickly. It's not designed to do that, but that's what the electric industry needs. And this is the question that I think policymakers and probably legislators are going to have to tackle, which is how do we create a construct for natural gas to be able to serve these very unique needs of the electric system for which it's not designed to do.
And so that's the challenge ahead, a natural gas plant design challenge. That and combating the absolute bullshittery being peddled about energy by the fossil fuel and nuclear power devotees in the Republican Party and the witnesses that they choose to call to these hearings. I do want to point out, though, that there was also one more opportunity for energy presented that I feel like we should all be aware of. So here's Mark Gabriel, the dude who oversees hydropower for about half of our country.
You've got to consider in the United States, only 3% of the 90,000 dams have power capabilities to them. And if anything, I think it's a valuable discussion to have to make sure that we are thinking about increasing hydropower, as it is a carbon-free resource and one that can help bolster a grid in times of great stress.
Only 3% of our dams have hydropower on them. I mean, that doesn't even require creating more dams. We already have them, and 97% of them are available for generating more electricity. I feel like there's huge potential there, and I just love knowing that. But basically, one of the reasons I went down this whole renewable rabbit hole is that it was such a big part of the hearing, and I wasn't expecting that. But I do think that you should know that I made a production decision, and I decided to essentially dismiss the testimony of Michael Schellenberger in this episode. And so if you want to hear from him, the link to the hearings are in the show notes for you. But I found Schellenberger to be someone willing to twist facts, like the 4-hour battery thing, to fit his agenda. I don't trust him. And so I'm not really looking into the stuff that he said. And also, someone I trust more than anyone else on the planet convinced me that Schellenberger just doesn't know his shit. So, that's another reason I just don't want to go putting information out there that is uninformed. And so here's one last highlight from the Green Room episode with Joe. Here's one more taste of Schellenberger.
Civilization depends on reliable electricity. I think everybody agrees with that. But then people need to explain how it is that variable renewable energy sources, which are weather dependent, are somehow add up to being reliable and resilient at grid levels. They don't. It actually just adds up to less reliability and less resilience, all else being equal.
What say you, utility scale solar engineer?
I say we're working on transitioning the grid, and once we get batteries, it'll all be good. And until then, natural gas peaker plants can fill in the gaps. We can phase out coal and nuclear. And as long as places like Texas and other places just have these basement, bare bottom requirements for design standards, this wouldn't be a problem. Like that dude from Maine said, gets fucking cold there too. Wind turbines kept spinning. They designed Texas for the hot days. They designed the grid for those hot days. They need to design them for the cold days now too.
And so here's one of the most important people in the energy game, one last time, telling Congress the 4 priorities that the international standard setters have for our national energy grid. Here's Jim Robb of NERC.
First, more investment in transmission and natural gas infrastructure is required to improve the resilience of the electric grid. Increased utility scale wind and solar will require new transmission to get power to load centers. Next, the regulatory structure and oversight of natural gas supply for the purposes of electric generation needs to be rethought. The natural gas system was not built and operated with electric reliability first in mind. Policy action and legislation will likely be needed to assure reliable fuel supply for electric generation. As the critical balancing resource, natural gas is the fuel that keeps the lights on. Third, the electric and natural gas systems must be better prepared for extreme weather conditions, which are frankly becoming more routine. Regulatory and market structures need to support this planning and the necessary investment to assure reliability. And finally, investment in energy storage or alternative technologies needs to be supported to have a viable alternative to natural gas for balancing variable resources. A technology which can be deployed cost effectively and at massive scale with adequate duration to deal with supply disruption lasting for days rather than hours is required.
Which all sounds good to me. Congressional Dish is a podcast that's paid for by the people who benefit from it. You, the listener. Every single person who contributes to this show in an amount equal to the value that you think it has, either for yourself or society. Well, every one of you who pays for this podcast is a producer, and producers get to participate in these conversations in the bonus thank you episodes. All you have to do is submit an email or a short voicemail along with your contribution, and it will make it on the show. But there are different levels of producers, and executive producers get to be heard on main episodes. And today, I'm excited to hear from 3 new executive producers who each have contributed at least $535 and will have their name listed as the executive producer on the episode of their choice. And so first, I would like to thank our anonymous producer, who is going to be the EP on Congressional Dish 227, the episode about the Corona bus. And along with that contribution, our anonymous friend said, "Thanks for what you do, relatively new to your show. So grateful for your work. Just finished the Corona Bus episode and I couldn't believe there weren't any executive producers. Please consider this small contribution support for that episode. No recognition needed. Well, even though you don't want your name on it, I think it's important for people to know which episodes are worthy of having an executive producer on it. And so on Congressional Dish 227, there is now an executive producer credit under the name Anonymous. So thank you so much for your contribution. You know who you are and you know you're very much appreciated. Also very much appreciated is Stephen McMahon of Portland, Oregon. And I'm so excited to see this name on an episode because Stephen McMahon has been producing this show for a million years. And so with his latest contribution, which was a check for $170, but I would be surprised if Stephen doesn't have multiple executive producer credits that he's eligible for. So this is going to be his first, but Stephen did send in that check and with the check sent in this note. So he said, Jen and Lauren, hope all is going well for your pod. Can't wait to hear where you will be moving to. And we don't really know yet. And I think that's the fun. We're not really moving to anywhere. We're just going to go where we want, when we want, and stop paying rent and being locked into years-long contracts in locations. So yeah, I'm excited. I'm going to be wherever I want to be. But back to his note, he said, I wish to use my executive producer credits for episode 102. And it's not in his note, but he thanks me for producing that episode, which was the one about the World Trade Organization. So when I talk about, the whole big picture, what are we doing in this world? It was really episode 102 that opened my eyes to that. And it all started because of a bill that became law. I'm pretty sure it was a dingleberry, but essentially our labels for certain kinds of meat, we used to have country of origin labels, which would tell us where our meat came from. And Congress repealed those labels. And I was sitting there thinking to myself, there's no way that there's an uproar in this country of people being like, I don't want to know where my food comes from. So there had to be another reason for them doing this. And it turns out it was because of the World Trade Organization, which, holy fucking rabbit hole, that became a whole thing. But that's really how I found out about the World Trade Organization and the fact that those international rules kind of, in effect, trump our laws, which also led me to the realization that implementing the economic system that is being administered by the World Trade Organization is kind of why we do everything we do militarily around the world. So yeah, huge rabbit hole. And it started with episode 102. So Stephen, thank you for executive producing that episode because it's such a good one. It's such an important one. Back to Stephen's note, he said, I still have not listened to Congressional Dish 228. I will get past my procrastination tomorrow. Thanks for all the good work, Stephen. Well, I hope you like the episode. And then we also have a new executive producer who is not a new producer. This is Garrick Smalley of Berkeley, California. He has been producing the show for a long time. But along with his latest $140 check, he said that he wanted to be the executive producer for Congressional Dish 186, the National Endowment for Democracy, another episode that I am so proud of and I think is so important. And I hope everybody listens to it because it's another one of those things how did I not know that this existed for as long as I didn't know? So yeah, that's such a good episode to pick. And here is Garrick's note. He said, Dear Jennifer Briney and the rest of the Congressional Dish gang, thank you for all you do at this podcast. I finally looked into how much I have donated over the years, and it looks like I have enough for a producer's credit as long as you add everything together. If I'm correct, I would love to be associated with number 186, the National Endowment for Democracy. This was my second time hearing about it, but your breakdown of it really scared the hell out of me. On a different matter, Jen, I have to disagree and agree with you on one matter. The matter of impeachment of the president. I agree that the Democrats did a horrible and useless job of impeaching Trump both times. They did not prove their case beyond a shadow of a doubt, as well as fixating on the wrong subject. You are correct on this aspect both times. Where you and I disagree is the level of proof needed for impeachment, again, both times. In a murder trial, the prosecution needs to prove their case beyond a shadow of a doubt because the penalty is loss of liberty and possibly money. In a civil trial, you can convict with less proof, and in some cases, you do not even need the entire 12-person jury to agree. Just 75% will do. I bring your attention to the murder trial of O.J. Simpson. He was found not guilty of the murders, but in the civil case, he was found responsible for the deaths. He had to pay a crap load of money for the deaths, but he served no prison time. Now to the impeachment. The only penalty is loss of the position and possibly never holding elected office again. There are no fines, no loss of liberty, and the prosecutors do not have to prove their case beyond a shadow of a doubt. The standard is therefore less stringent than even in a civil case. As you said in your sum up, he should be impeached for the things he did do. As Mitch McConnell said, Trump is responsible for the shit he pulled at the Capitol. As I say, he should have been impeached on day 2 for raising the membership dues to his golf club. Just to show you how much I disagree with you, here is a check for $140. I will let you guess how I came up with that number. Your friend, Garrick Smalley. $140. I have absolutely no idea. That is quite the pickle. So Garrick, please reach out to me again and tell me why it was 140. I'm drawing a complete blank. But I mean, obviously we disagree on the impeachment stuff, which is totally fine. But I think the comparison to O.J. Simpson is a really good one because O.J. Simpson, in the civil case that you bring up, yeah, the standard wasn't as high. And so he did have to pay money to the families of Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson. But in that civil case, he was still accused of murder. So what happened in the impeachment trial, especially the second one, it would have been equivalent to O.J. Simpson being accused of rape instead of murder in the civil trial, because an insurrection is just not what happened. Again, the people that went into the Capitol that day were supporters of Donald Trump. They were not trying to overthrow his government. So you can call that a riot, but they decided to call it an incitement of insurrection. And so, you know, there's just a lot that I can't get over there. I understand that we want to hold Trump accountable and that at the end of the day, none of those people would have been there without Donald Trump. I mean, I said all of this in that episode, but I do think it matters what the charges are. And that charge was inaccurate to the point of just being so wrong that I just don't see how, even with a lower standard of proof, that we can say that that was an insurrection. It just wasn't. Even when the people got in there, they didn't seem to know what to do. They certainly weren't trying to overthrow the government. They weren't trying to take control of Congress. They just got in. So yeah, insurrection just does not work. And it was the Democrats' choice to go that extreme with the charges. And so, yeah, O.J. Simpson, at least the civil trial, they decided to try to prosecute him there for the accurate crime of murder and not something that he didn't actually do, that didn't actually happen. So, and we can agree to disagree with that on that. Like, that's totally fine. That's why I like this relationship that we have. Yeah, thanks so much for supporting the show. And yeah, please let me know why 140. You didn't even put anything on the memo line of the check. I have no idea. And this is going to make me insane. So please let me know why you picked $140. I'm so curious. Let's see. Okay, so this is the end of this episode. And real quick, before I wrap this up, I just got my vaccine. So I wanted to have this episode finished before I got the vaccine, or it's my second dose. So this is the one that's supposed to be like scary. So I got it about 5 hours ago, and I've got to tell you, my arm hurts. So I did the whole thing where I moved my arm the whole time while I was sitting there, just like I did with the first shot. After the first shot, I got Pfizer. After the first shot, I didn't feel anything. My arm was perfectly fine. And I was the only one in my family because I was the only one that was like doing the chicken dance and doing the Macarena. Although I didn't do the Macarena. That was the only one I couldn't participate in. But I did the YMCA and I was moving my arm the entire time during those 15 minutes and I felt fine. But today, ooh, it hurts. It hurts. But other than that, I'm feeling fine, which is why I was able to finish this episode. The brain fog has not sunk in yet. And yeah, so I did that, and it's up to you whether or not you do, but I just wanted to let you know that my experience has been nothing but positive. I can tell you my county, because I went to one of the county sites, was super efficient. I was so impressed with the way they had the whole thing set up. Both times, in and out, half hour. It was so easy. So I'm super impressed with the way that Ventura County has handled the whole thing. Yeah, and right now I feel perfectly fine. Let's hope it stays that way. I also want to let you guys know, and thank you again to Nicholas Zacharias, that I got to do something so cool, which is that I got to go on the Bad Faith podcast, which is hosted by Brianna Joy Gray, who used to be Bernie Sanders' press secretary during his last campaign. She was also one of the leaders I think she was the senior political editor. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. But she definitely worked at The Intercept, so she's a good journalist. And now she's this brilliant podcast host. She co-hosts it with Virgil Texas, who you might know from Chapo Trap House, these are people that have the whole business model of podcasting figured out far beyond what I do. So these are people I'm impressed with myself for knowing. And then, so we went on Zoom. That's how we did the episode, and it's on YouTube if you want to see it. But I didn't know that there was going to be a fourth person in our conversation. And it was David Dayen. And what was crazy about it is that before I went on the Zoom, I was in my email. So I was reading a newsletter from David Dayen. Then I popped over to Zoom, and then boom, there he is. And I actually kind of freaked out a little bit. I was like, oh my God, David Dayen's in here. So one of my favorite journalists just pops up onto the screen. I had no idea I would be speaking not only to him, but with him about congressional things. And I was so intimidated and just... I was starstruck. Because this is someone I've been reading his work now for at least 5 years. And especially during COVID, he was doing a newsletter every day. And so he was really keeping me up to date. And he's not a Cassandra. He's just, just the facts. And yeah, just one of my favorite journalists. And I got to actually talk to him for an hour with two other people that I really like. And so that was one of the coolest things I've ever done. Nicholas Zacharias, I do have to say, is the marketing member of the month. And so you are absolutely getting some Congressional Dish swag sent your way. But basically, Nicholas Zacharias reached out to Brianna, told her about the show. She checked it out. She actually contributed to the show. And now we're friends. And I got introduced to her enormous audience this week. So thank you again, Brianna and Virgil, for having me. It was so much fun. And if you guys want to hear a really wonky conversation, if you like Congressional Dish, you'll like this conversation. And it felt so good for me to be out of my league. These are people that know DC inside and out. So it was really cool for me to be a part of a conversation with people that know so much more than I do. It was just like so intellectually stimulating. And so that is now on the internet. If you guys want to check it out, you can go to my Twitter feed at Jen Briney, and you'll find it in my profile or whatever. But yeah, you can find the link, either YouTube or of course it's a podcast, so wherever podcasts are found. But that was super cool. And thank you, Nick. You did an excellent job for the marketing department of Congressional Dish. And I'm very proud of you, sir. So thank you very much. The next episode, I'm going to have to do it. I'm going to have to read the American Rescue Plan. And I know it's a little late, but what I'm excited about is because it's so late, and the American Rescue Plan is the official name of the Biden era COVID relief law. And basically the reason I still want to read this is I want to know how many of those provisions are long lasting, because when it was passed, Biden was being all over the place compared with FDR, who gave us the New Deal, Social Security. I mean, these are long lasting things. And so I want to see how much of this is actually long lasting, or is the entire bill going to expire at the end of the year, and then we're just back to where we were. So I'm really checking the dates. And you guys know from all my COVID coverage that I've been really obsessed with the dates, because we kept having to have all these COVID relief laws because they were artificially setting these expiration dates, knowing damn well that the emergency wasn't going to be over. And so I'm curious what this last one did. How different is it from the others? And then also, as David Dayen pointed out in our conversation on the Bad Faith podcast, implementation matters. And so we do have a little bit of distance between that becoming law and right now. And so we can see how much of this was put into law and not implemented, or how much of this became law and has been implemented and has made a real difference. And so those are kind of the angles I'm looking at. It's going to take me 3 weeks to do this one, so you can expect that episode in the middle of May. And yeah, I'll have a thank you episode out next week before the end of April. And if you have anything about that COVID relief law that you think I need to see, please send it to me, jen@congressionaldish.com. I am definitely wanting to know what you know about the implementation of the American Rescue Plan, Act. I don't know. I don't even know what the name of it is yet, so I'm clearly starting from scratch. But yeah, thank you so much to all producers of Congressional Dish. I love you all, and I will talk to you soon. Mwah!
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite of any in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. What the facts? And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, in the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can't stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.